The Harbor Chart House. Episode 2, Rain Lines on the Old Quay. Beads of rainwater were gathering along the handrail in the covered passage, each one holding for a moment beneath the warm courtyard lamp, before slipping quietly toward the next. Nora Venn stood just inside the passage and watched 3 of them join. The first trembled against the painted metal. The second widened it. The third gave the little weight of water enough reason to move, and the joined drop slid along the rail until it met a shallow dip and rested there again. Beyond the open side of the passage, rain crossed the sheltered courtyard in fine, slanting lines. It was not heavy rain. There was no force in it, and no hurry. The roof took most of it. What remained touched the paving with a soft, close sound, like fingertips moving over a tabletop. At the nearest corner, water descended from the gutter through a plain iron rain chain, passing link by link before reaching the stones below. Nora drew one slow breath of the cool mineral air. It smelled of wet stone, iron, and the faint dry dust that always seemed to wait inside old buildings, even on rainy evenings. Her body had settled into the pace of the walk from the street. Shoulders loose beneath her coat, hands warm inside her pockets, steps still measured by the damp paving outside. She did not need to quicken them now. The Harbor Chart House had already closed to visitors, and the evening's work was waiting exactly where Jonas Reed had said it would be. The route for the shift was a small one. The long map room opened directly from the covered passage. The passage led to the courtyard. She would need nothing beyond those 3 places until the comparison was done. Even the small kitchen could wait. Nora had brought a flask, and it sat in her work bag with a wrapped piece of bread and cheese, enough for a pause later without widening the evening's path. She wiped the soles of her shoes on the mat and entered the long map room. The room lived up to its name without making a ceremony of it. A single narrow table ran through most of its length, with flat drawers on one side and tall windows on the other. Tonight the windows reflected the shaded lamps within, so that the table appeared twice, once beneath Nora's hands and once floating dimly in the glass. Rain ticked against the panes in a pattern finer than the sound in the courtyard. 3 dated plans of the Old Quay lay on the table beneath clear protective sheets. Jonas had arranged them side by side before leaving. He had placed a small folded support beneath one softened corner and set clean weights near the other edges without lowering them yet. Beside the plans was his brief note in blue pencil. 3 courtyard plans, it said. Compare rain channels if weather permits. No marking on originals. That last instruction hardly needed writing, but Nora liked that Jonas wrote such things anyway. His notes did not presume carelessness. They simply left the work in a calm, usable state, the way a good label left a drawer ready to be opened. She removed her coat and hung it from the peg beside the passage door. A few droplets shone on one shoulder. She brushed them away with the back of her hand, not because they mattered, but because the motion completed her arrival. Her work bag went beneath the table. From it she took a soft graphite pencil, a clean eraser, a magnifier in a cloth sleeve, and the bone folder inherited from her former workshop. The folder's surface had been worn smooth long before it came to her. It fitted her hand without asking to be noticed, pale and familiar among the darker tools. She set it beside the weights. The plans were not identical in size. The earliest was drawn on warm cream paper with a slightly uneven lower edge. The second was broader and more formal, with a ruled border. The third had the pale, firm look of a sheet made for municipal copying, though its lines had still been drawn by hand. Each showed the same modest part of the chart house grounds: the covered passage, the courtyard paving, the wall toward the inner quay, and the narrow service edge, where rainwater was directed away from the doors. Their dates were easy to read beneath the protective film. Years separated them, but not so many that the courtyard had become a different place. Nora did not begin comparing the lines yet. First, she walked to the far end of the table and turned on the second shaded lamp. Its light widened across the protective sheets without glare. The plans grew clearer while the room remained gentle around them. Cream paper, ruled border, pale copy sheet. 3 quiet rectangles, each holding an earlier arrangement of the stones outside. She returned to the passage door and looked back. The evening's route now seemed almost like a diagram of itself. The long table lay behind her. The handrail ran beside her. Beyond it waited the small paved courtyard. She would move from paper to stone and back again, no farther. The unfinished task was equally contained. 3 plans had to be aligned, their scales checked, and their rain lines compared with the route taken by water tonight. Nothing needed to be decided before she had looked carefully. Nora stepped into the covered passage once more. Water had continued collecting along the rail. The larger bead in the shallow dip had grown round and clear, reflecting the courtyard lamp as a small amber oval. Under the roof, the flagstones remained mostly dry. Only a darkened margin marked the place where the rain reached inward. She followed the passage at an easy pace, one hand resting lightly above the rail without touching it. The courtyard was sheltered on all sides, open only to the quiet weather above. Stone walls softened the harbor sounds until the water beyond the building was no more than a low breathing presence. Somewhere outside the courtyard, a line tapped mildly against a mast and then was still. Within the walls, the rain chain gave a gentler rhythm. Water touching iron, descending, touching iron again. At the courtyard threshold, Nora stopped. She did not cross the paving yet. That belonged to the first round of the work, after the plans had been made ready. For now, she simply let her eyes adjust to the difference between lamplight and rain-dark stone. The courtyard lamp stood beneath the eave, protected by a shallow hood. Its light spread across the nearest slabs and weakened toward the opposite wall. The stones did not form a single flat surface. Their edges rose and settled by small degrees, enough to guide water, but not enough to trouble a walking foot. Narrow seams made an irregular pattern between them. Near the bottom of the rain chain, the paving was darker. From there, a thread of water moved away across the slabs. At this distance, Nora could see its shine, but not its exact course. It appeared, vanished where the lamp caught the stone differently, and appeared once more nearer the center. That was enough for arrival. Observation could wait until her tools and sheets were in order. She turned back along the passage. The handrail beads were different now. The large one had moved on, leaving a bright track no wider than a pencil line. Smaller drops were already gathering in its place. Nora watched one settle, then continued into the map room. At the table, she rolled up her sleeves and washed her hands at the small basin set into the room's end cabinet. The water from the tap was cool. She dried her hands thoroughly on a clean cotton towel, working around each finger and across both palms. Then she stood for a moment without touching the plans, allowing the last trace of moisture to leave her skin. The repaired walking map from her previous shift was not in this room, yet she knew where it rested. On her way in, she had seen it lying safely in the reading room, beneath its clean protective cover. The small correction at the bench finished and undisturbed. There had been no reason to stop or lift the cover. Its work belonged to that earlier evening. Tonight's sheets waited here. Nora lowered the first pair of clean weights onto the protective sheet above the earliest plan. She did it lightly, one at each sound edge, so the paper beneath remained still without being pressed flat against its nature. The second plan received 2 weights as well. On the third, Jonas had left a slip of archival board beneath one side, supporting a slight wave in the paper. Nora kept the support where it was and placed the weight farther inward. A visible order began to form. Loose protective sheets became steady surfaces. The tools gathered in a line at Nora's right hand. The plans, which had seemed merely adjacent when she entered, now presented their borders clearly beneath the lamps. She picked up the bone folder and used its rounded end only as a pointer above the clear film. She traced the air over the corners of the earliest plan: passage wall, courtyard wall, quayside boundary, inner doorway. Then she moved to the second and third sheets, finding the same 4 points without yet judging how the lines between them had changed. The bone folder never touched the paper. Its pale tip traveled over the protective layer, pausing above each corner and lifting again. There was pleasure in delaying interpretation until the materials were ready. Nora had learned that most confusion at a work table came from asking a sheet to explain itself too soon. First came orientation, then scale, then comparison. Meaning could arrive after those quieter things had been given room. She set the folder down and leaned close enough to read the scale bar on the first plan. The figures were small but distinct. The second used a different interval. The third returned to something close to the first, though its border allowed more empty space around the drawing. On a clean scrap of paper, Nora wrote only the 3 dates, leaving a broad blank beside each. She would add measurements later. She made no headings about drainage, no arrows, and no early conclusion. Outside, rain moved across the windows in threads. Some drops joined and traveled downward. Others held to the glass, bright in the reflected lamps. Their paths looked purposeful, only because gravity was patient. Nora placed a fresh sheet of tracing film on the unused end of the table. It curled gently from having been stored in a roll. She did not flatten it yet. That transparent sheet was for later, if the comparison proved useful. For the moment, it remained empty, catching the lamplight along its curved edge. She checked the room once more. 3 protected plans lay steady. The scale bars were visible. Graphite and eraser waited beside the blank notes. The bone folder rested near her right hand. Beyond the open door, the covered passage led straight toward the sheltered courtyard, where the rain chain continued its soft, measured descent. Nora drew the stool nearer but did not sit. Her walking pace had left her now. In its place was the slower balance of work. Feet settled, breathing even, attention narrowing comfortably to the table. She looked from the earliest plan to the latest, then toward the rain-dark courtyard beyond the passage. The ordinary task remained unfinished, as it should at the beginning of an evening. 3 old drawings waited to be aligned. 1 present stream waited to be observed. Between them lay only a short covered walk, a few patient tools, and enough rain to make the stones legible. Nora began with the earliest plan. She moved the clean scrap of paper nearer and wrote the plan's date at the top, then added the scale interval beside it. The graphite left a soft gray line, dark enough to read without needing pressure. Beneath that, she made 4 small marks for the corners she had already identified: the covered passage, the courtyard wall, the quayside boundary, and the inner doorway. The protective sheet remained between her hands and the old paper. Whenever she needed to indicate a point, she used the rounded end of the bone folder above the clear surface. The familiar tool moved lightly from one corner to the next, never pressing, never dragging. Its smooth, ivory-colored edge caught the shaded lamp for a moment, each time she lifted it. She laid a narrow strip of clean archival board along the ruled edge of the protective sheet. It was not a ruler and would not be used for measuring. It simply gave her eye a straight line from which to judge the drawing beneath. The earliest plan had been made with a practical hand. Its courtyard was slightly out of square on the page, though the measurements written beside the walls were regular enough. Nora looked from the upper left corner to the lower right, then from the upper right to the lower left. She adjusted the board by the width of a pencil line. One of the clear weights sat a little too close to the border she needed to see. She lifted it with both hands, moved it toward the sound outer margin, and lowered it again. The whole sheet stayed still. That was the first small change of the work. The corners were now visible together, the plan supported but unobstructed. Nothing beneath the protective layer had moved. Only the objects above it had found better places. Nora turned to the second plan. Its ruled border made alignment easier, but its scale bar used broader divisions. She read the figures once, then again through the magnifier. The glass enlarged the fine ink and the soft fibers of the paper beneath it. The line that had appeared perfectly black from standing height proved to be a deep brown, with tiny variations where the pen had passed more slowly. She returned the magnifier to its cloth sleeve before writing. On her scrap, she added the second date and scale interval, leaving space between that entry and the first. The third plan required a different adjustment. Its sheet was wider, and the courtyard occupied a smaller part of the available paper. Nora did not try to make its outer edges match those of the other two. Instead, she chose the inner doorway as a common point. She placed a small square of removable low-tack tape on the protective sheet above that doorway. The tape touched only the modern clear layer. On the other two protective sheets, she placed matching squares over the same architectural point. 3 pale tabs now stood in a row across the table. From the doorway, she found the beginning of the covered passage wall on each plan and added a second set of tabs. The spacing between the tabs differed from sheet to sheet because the drawn scales differed. Yet the paired points gave her a stable way to look across the 3 plans without forcing them into false agreement. She checked the scale bars once more. For the earliest plan, one drawn interval represented a modest distance along the courtyard wall. On the second, the same real distance occupied less paper. On the third, it occupied almost the same length as on the first, though not quite. Nora took a pair of dividers from the shallow tool tray Jonas had left at the end of the table. Their points were capped with soft removable guards so they could be used over the protective sheets without making a mark. She opened them to the first plan's scale interval and held them just above the film. One guarded point rested visually at the beginning of the scale bar. The other came to its end. She lifted the dividers without sliding them and carried that opening to the courtyard wall. One interval, then another, then part of a third. She did not set the points down. The measurement was approximate, enough to orient the later comparison. On her scrap, she drew a short horizontal line beside the earliest date and wrote the represented length beneath it. Then she reset the dividers for the second plan. The hinge gave a quiet, dry resistance. Nora tightened it with her fingertips until the opening held. She checked the scale bar, transferred the interval to her notes, and repeated the process on the third plan. Soon the scrap held 3 small reference lines. They were different lengths on the page, but each represented the same distance in the courtyard. Nora set the dividers back in the tray, with their guards still in place. The plans could now be compared without confusing a difference in drawing scale for a difference in the stones themselves. Rain continued at the windows. Its fine tapping came and went as a breeze shifted above the courtyard walls. Underneath it sounded the steadier descent along the roof chain. A soft touch on one iron link, then another, then the faint patter where the water reached the paving. Nora looked toward the open passage door. Before going outside, she prepared only what she would need for observation. She took a small clipboard and fixed a clean sheet of paper beneath its metal edge. At the top, she wrote present route. Under that, she drew a plain rectangle to stand for the courtyard, placing the passage along one side and the rain chain near the corner. It was not yet a record. It was only a frame in which a record could be made. She added no waterline. From the drawer beneath the table, she chose a folding rule with clear dark markings. When opened, it would be long enough to estimate the width of several paving stones without touching the stream. She wiped its already clean surface with a dry cloth, folded it again, and slipped it beneath the clipboard clip. The soft graphite pencil went into the narrow groove at the top. Nora considered taking the magnifier, then left it in its sleeve. The courtyard did not need magnifying. It needed an unhurried look from more than one angle. She moved the empty tracing film farther from the edge of the table, so its curl could not catch her sleeve on her return. 2 clean weights held its upper corners now. The lower edge still rose in a gentle arc, but the sheet no longer shifted in the draft from the passage. That was another visible change. The transparent film had begun the evening as a loose roll. It now waited as a clear working surface, blank and safely held, ready only after the present route had been seen. Nora checked each protective sheet before leaving the table. The weights were stable. The archival support beneath the third plan remained in place. The low-tack tabs marked only the clear coverings. The lamps cast even light across all 3 dates. She picked up the clipboard and stepped into the covered passage. The air there felt cooler than it had at her arrival, though the rain itself had not grown heavier. The handrail was beaded from end to end. Drops gathered along its lower edge as well, smaller and more closely spaced than those on top. Nora walked toward the courtyard at the same measured pace she had used before. But this time she continued beyond the threshold. The covered passage opened onto a narrow, dry margin beneath the eave. She stayed there for a few moments, allowing the pattern on the stones to settle into view. Water descended from the roof chain in broken silver lengths. Each link held a little of it, let it pass, and shone briefly after it had gone. At the bottom, the water met a small dark patch in the paving. From that patch, a thin stream moved outward. Nora watched without drawing. The stream did not run in a straight line. It crossed the first stone close to one edge, reached a narrow joint, and followed that joint for a short distance. Then it left the seam and curved over the face of the next slab, where the stone dipped almost too slightly to see. Under the courtyard lamp, the water appeared as a moving line of brightness. Beyond the strongest part of the light, it became a dark thread instead. Farther on, it shone again where it turned toward the grated channel along the wall. The grate was narrow and ordinary, set flush with the surrounding paving. Rain reached it quietly. There was no gathering pool around it, and no troubled sound beneath it. The thin stream simply divided across 2 small openings and disappeared from the surface. Nora let the route repeat. Water arrived by the chain. It spread at the first stone. It follows the seam. It curved across the next slab. It passed one darker joint and bent toward the grate. The same motion happened again, never with exactly the same edge, but with the same overall course. Only after she had watched several repetitions did Nora lower the clipboard. On the plain rectangle, she marked the chain with a small circle. She marked the grated channel with 2 parallel lines. Between them, she placed short strokes for the paving joints she could see from where she stood. She did not draw the stream yet. Instead, she moved 3 slow steps along the dry margin under the eave. From there, the shallow curve across the central slab was easier to see. The surface of that stone tilted in 2 directions, gently away from the passage and slightly toward the wall. The stream responded to both slopes, bending between them. Nora opened the folding rule. She held it above the paving, keeping its end clear of the water and its edges away from the stone. The first slab was a little longer than it had appeared from the threshold. She noted the estimate beside the rectangle. The neighboring slab was narrower. Its seam began near the foot of the chain, but did not continue all the way to the grated channel. She folded one section of the rule and used the shortened length to judge the distance from the stream's curve to the courtyard wall. Again, she kept the tool above the surface. The measurement did not need to be exact to the smallest division. It needed only to help her place the root correctly in relation to the stones. She wrote the estimate. The graphite sounded faintly rough against the paper, close to her hand but nearly lost beneath the rain. Now she drew the present waterline. Beginning at the small circle for the chain, she guided the pencil along the first paving edge. She paused at the seam, changed direction, and made the low curve across the central slab. From there, she carried the line toward the paired marks of the grate. The pencil line was light. If she found on returning that she had placed it poorly, the eraser could remove it without difficulty. Nothing about the field sketch needed to be permanent. Nora looked up and compared the mark with the water. The first section was right. The seam was right. The curve needed to begin a little sooner. She rubbed out less than an inch of graphite, with a clean eraser fixed to the clipboard clip. The pale crumbs rested on the paper. She brushed them into her palm, slipped them into her coat pocket for disposal later, and redrew the curve. The revised line turned sooner and reached the grate at a gentler angle. Nora watched another thread of water travel from chain to channel. Her drawing now followed it closely enough. At the edge of the dry margin, one paving joint formed a useful reference point. It met the passage threshold beneath the third upright of the handrail. Nora added the upright to her sketch and connected it to the joint with a dotted guide. That would allow her to orient the present route against the plans without relying on memory alone. She folded the rule completely and fastened it beneath the clipboard clip again. Then she stood quietly for another minute. There was no need to search the rest of the courtyard. The route was visible from the sheltered edge, and the evening's bounded path did not require more. Rain continued to leave the roof by the same chain and cross the same some few stones. The grated channel received it with the same mild, even sound. Nora turned back toward the long map room. She made only the one courtyard walk. There would be no circling for a second impression, no repeated journey between paper and stone. She had the fixed references she needed. The chain, the threshold, the third handrail upright, the paving joints, and the narrow grate. As she passed along the handrail, a joined drop moved beside her for a short distance. It slipped through a shallow dip in the metal and stopped at the next upright, while Nora continued indoors. The warmth of the map room lamps met her at the door. She placed the clipboard on the empty end of the table, well apart from the protected plans. The folding rule returned to the drawer. The graphite pencil went beside her notes. She brushed one last speck of eraser dust from the field sheet and checked that the paper was dry. Then she stood between the present sketch and the three old plans. The paired low-tack tabs still marked the common doorway and passage wall. The three reference lines on her scrap kept their scales distinct. The clear tracing film waited under its two weights, empty except for the reflection of the shaded lamp. Nora did not begin interpreting the differences. She first rotated the clipboard so that its passage edge faced the same direction as the passages on the plans. The little circle for the roof chain settled near the corresponding courtyard corner. The dotted guide from the third handrail upright gave her a second point of orientation. She placed one final removable tab on the clipboard sheet beside that guide. Across the table, paper and present stone now shared a common direction. The old plans remained untouched beneath their coverings. The field sketch could be erased. The tabs could be lifted. The tracing film could still be returned blank to its roll. Everything she had done was reversible, but the table had changed. What had begun as three separate drawings was now an orderly comparison. Corners aligned by reference, scales made legible, and the current rain route resting beside them in a light graphite curve. Nora drew the stool close and sat down. Outside, water passed link by link along the roof chain and bent across the courtyard stones toward the grate. Inside, beneath the quiet lamps, she looked from the earliest plan to the next, and then to the latest, ready to see where each one had placed that same ordinary journey. Nora began with the common doorway. The pale, removable tabs above it formed a quiet line across the 3 protective sheets, and the matching tab on her field sketch gave the present courtyard the same direction. From that doorway she followed the covered passage wall with the rounded end of the bone folder, holding the smooth tip just above the clear film. On the earliest plan, the wall led her eye toward the corner where the rain chain now descended. A small ink mark showed the place where water had been received at ground level. From there, a narrow ruled line crossed the drawn paving. Nora stopped above it. The line was so modest that it had blended at first with the joints between stones. It did not carry a written explanation. There was no arrow and no note in the margin. The person who had drawn the plan had simply included the shallow run among the other practical features of the courtyard. She set the bone folder down and brought her magnifier from its cloth sleeve. Under the glass, the line became easier to distinguish. The paving joints were drawn with a fine, even hand. The drainage line was slightly darker and less regular. It began close to the rain chain corner, traveled diagonally across 2 broad slabs, and met the wall channel farther along than the present stream did. Nora looked at her field sketch. Tonight's water left the first seam sooner. It curved across the central slab and reached the graded channel nearer the middle of the wall. The old line and the present route began in nearly the same place, but they did not end together. She wrote nothing yet. Instead, she moved the magnifier to the second plan. The broader scale made the courtyard smaller on the sheet, though her reference marks kept its orientation clear. Here the drainage run had been drawn as a shallow double line, perhaps to show a narrow-formed channel between the paving stones. It started near the same courtyard corner and passed across a different sequence of joints. Nora followed it with her eye. This second route bent earlier than the first. It reached the wall nearer the position shown on her field sketch, but not quite at the same point. The difference was only the width of part of a paving slab in the real courtyard. On paper, after allowing for scale, it was scarcely more than the space between 2 graphite strokes. She shifted the magnifier to the latest plan. This sheet was the palest and most orderly of the 3. Its stone joints formed a careful pattern of rectangles and softened quadrilaterals. Near the foot of the rain chain, a short line followed one joint, crossed a slab, and then turned toward the graded channel. Nora sat back. The latest route resembled the one she had watched outside. It used the same general bend, yet it entered the grate a little farther toward the quayside boundary, while the present stream arrived slightly nearer the passage. 4 routes now rested before her, 3 in old ink and 1 in erasable graphite. They did not coincide. The differences were small, but they were consistent enough not to be explained by the different drawing scales. Nora checked that before allowing herself any interpretation. She lifted the dividers from their tray, kept the guarded points above the protective film, and opened them to the reference interval she had drawn for the earliest plan. One interval confirmed the distance from doorway to rain chain corner. A second gave her the approximate width of the central paving. She compared the old drainage line with those fixed measurements, then repeated the process for the second and third plans. The hinge of the dividers moved with its quiet resistance. Open, check, lift. Close slightly, check again. Each transfer remained above the clear covering. The result did not change. The earliest line lay farthest toward the quayside boundary. The second moved inward. The latest returned a little, then ended nearer the present grate entry, without matching it. Tonight's graphite route sat nearest the passage side for part of its course, before curving toward the same wall channel. Nora returned the dividers to their tray. She looked not at the water lines now, but at the stones drawn around them. On the earliest plan, 3 long slabs crossed the center of the courtyard. Their joints ran almost continuously from the passage side toward the opposite wall. On the second, those long stones were gone. The paving had been divided into smaller pieces, and one joint met the drainage run at a new angle. The third plan showed another arrangement. A broad central slab appeared there, close in size to the one outside beneath the courtyard lamp. But its narrow neighbor lay on the other side. The seam below the third handrail upright had shifted as well. Nora drew the field sketch closer. Her dotted guide connected that upright to the joint she had observed. On the latest plan, the corresponding joint met the passage threshold a short distance farther along. On the middle plan, it did not meet the threshold at all. It ended against one of the longer stones then in use. The discovery was not simply that the water had wandered. The paving beneath it had changed. Nora rested both hands on the table, away from the protected plans, and let the four arrangements settle in her mind. The courtyard stones had been reset over the years. Not all at once, perhaps, and not in the same pattern each time. The plans showed no grand rebuilding. The walls remained where they had been. The covered passage kept its line. The rain chain occupied the same useful corner, and the narrow receiving channel stayed along the same wall. Only the fitted surface between them had been adjusted. A long stone had been replaced by two shorter ones. A joint had been turned. The broad slab near the center had appeared, disappeared, or been moved before taking something like its present place. With each arrangement, the shallow route offered to rainwater had shifted by a little. Nora leaned forward again. The earliest drainage line had followed the low edge of one long slab. The second had used a joint introduced by the smaller stones. The latest line crossed the broad central piece, at an angle close to tonight's curve. The water had not failed to obey an intended course. It had simply responded to the surface available in each period. Outside, the roof chain continued its gentle measure. Water touched iron, passed downward, and reached the stones. Nora could hear the faint patter from where she sat, though she could no longer see the stream itself. She did not need another courtyard walk. She had already watched the present route repeat, and the field sketch fixed it to the third upright, the visible seams and the grate. She picked up her graphite pencil. Beside the earliest date on her notes, she wrote long central stones. Run follows lower joint. Beside the second, smaller reset paving. Route turns earlier. Beside the third, broad central slab. Shallow cross slab curve. She paused beside the present entry. Present stones reset again, she wrote. Curve begins nearer passage. Same chain and wall channel. The words were plain and provisional. They described what could be seen without claiming to know who had lifted the stones, exactly when each piece had moved, or what ordinary work had made the resetting useful. Such details were not needed for the comparison. The drawings already supplied enough. Each plan recorded the courtyard as it stood at its own date. Each maker had drawn the rain route appropriate to that arrangement. Tonight's stream supplied a fourth state, equally ordinary and equally temporary in the long life of a paved place. Nora read the 4 notes from top to bottom. The changes formed maintenance history. There was no sign of damage in the comparison. The present water did not gather against a doorway or spread over the dry margin. It traveled cleanly from the roof chain to the grated channel. The earlier routes had done the same work across earlier patterns of stone. What persisted was not a single fixed line. What persisted was the courtyard's quiet habit of carrying rain away from the passage. Nora looked again at the latest plan. Its drainage mark could easily have been mistaken for an imperfect copy of the earlier one. Placed alone, it might have seemed too slight to matter. Beside the other 2 plans and the field sketch, its value became clearer. It showed one useful moment between arrangements. She turned the magnifier slightly. Lamplight moved across the glass and passed away. At the edge of the third plan, A few paving lines had been strengthened where they met the wall channel. The ink there was no darker in meaning than elsewhere. The draftsperson had probably returned to make the junction legible. Nora could see the separate pen strokes under magnification. She followed them toward the drawn grate. The receiving channel remained in nearly the same position on all 3 sheets. Its length varied slightly with the plan scale and the amount of detail included, but its relationship to the courtyard wall did not. The rain chain, too, stayed close to its present corner. Those stable points explained why the comparison worked. Between chain and channel, the paving pattern had been free to alter. A mason could lift a settled slab, renew its bed, and return it at a slightly different level. A worn stone could be replaced. 2 smaller pieces could occupy the space once held by one longer piece. Each modest act would give water a revised edge to follow. Nora did not imagine the workers or add a history the sheets could not provide. She kept her attention on the visible sequence. Long stones, smaller reset paving, broad central slab, present curve. She placed the magnifier back in its cloth sleeve and laid it beside the bone folder. For a while she listened. The long map room held several layers of rain. Fine drops ticked against the windows. Water descended the chain beyond the passage. At longer intervals, a fuller run passed through the grated channel with a low sound against stone. None of it disturbed the papers beneath their protective sheets. Nora rose from the stool and changed her angle of view. Standing above the table, she could see all 4 routes more easily. The oldest ran outward before turning. The second bent inward. The third crossed the center at a mild diagonal. Her graphite line took the shallow curve she had watched beneath the lamp. They looked almost like 4 strands laid loosely between the same 2 points. For the first time that evening, Nora glanced toward the blank tracing film at the unused end of the table. It remained held by 2 clean weights. Its lower edge still rose in a soft, transparent curve. The sheet had not yet received a mark, but now she knew what it needed to hold. Not one corrected route, all 4. The old plans did not contradict one another, and the present stream did not prove any of them wrong. Combining them into a single fixed line would erase the very thing the comparison had revealed. The useful record would preserve each course separately, while keeping the chain, passage, wall, and grated channel aligned. Nora moved the film a hand's breadth nearer. Careful not to bring it over the original sheets, she did not draw on it yet. First, she tested the idea with the bone folder. Holding the rounded tip above the blank film, she traced 4 imaginary lines from one shared starting point to one shared receiving edge. The first traveled outward, the second turned earlier. The third crossed at a mild angle. The fourth curved nearer the passage before settling toward the channel. The transparent surface caught only their motions, not their marks. That would be the next stage of the work, a removable overlay, dated and keyed, recording the changes without asking any original sheet to carry a new line. Nora returned the bone folder to the right of her notes. She checked her interpretation once more against the plans. The paving joints supported it. The scale references supported it. The present sketch, anchored to the third handrail upright, supported it. Nothing required a second visit outside, and nothing remained uncertain about the evening's small question. The shallow drainage line had occupied slightly different positions because the courtyard stones had been reset over time. Rain had followed each arrangement toward the same ordinary destination. Nora added one final sentence beneath her notes. 4 useful routes across changing paving. She left space below it for the key she would make. Then she arranged the table for the work to follow. The 3 plans stayed beneath their protective sheets, each held by clean weights. Her field sketch remained on the clipboard, dry and erasable. The scale references sat between them. She placed the blank tracing film on a separate clear area, its edge parallel to the passage wall shown on the drawings. Outside, another thin stream crossed the courtyard. Nora could picture its course without leaving her stool. From the iron chain to the first dark seam, over the shallow dip of the broad slab, and onward to the grate. Beneath that present curve rested the remembered positions of other stones, preserved not as a puzzle, but as careful evidence of ordinary upkeep. She drew the graphite pencil toward her and turned the blank film so its smooth working side faced upward. The discovery had become clear enough to use. Nora began by giving the transparent film the same direction as the plans. She lowered its curved edge with one clean weight, then another, until the sheet rested evenly on the clear part of the table. It was not perfectly flat. A faint lift remained near one corner, no more than the memory of the roll in which it had been stored. She placed the smooth side of her bone folder against that corner, and guided it outward with one light pass. The film settled. Under the shaded lamp, its edges were visible only where they gathered a narrow line of brightness. The rest of it seemed almost absent. Nora could see the grain of the table beneath it, and reflected faintly above the windows crossed by rain. She did not place the film over any of the old plans. The protective sheets already gave the originals a safe surface, and there was no reason to add another moving layer above them. Instead, she drew a simple working frame on the film at the same scale as her field sketch. The first graphite mark was the covered passage wall. She made it lightly, using the straight edge of the archival board as a guide. A second line marked the courtyard wall with the grated channel. Between them she left the open shape of the paving. At the rain chain corner, she added a small circle. Along the receiving wall, she drew two narrow parallel strokes for the grate. These were the fixed points, the parts that had remained useful through every arrangement shown on the table. Once they were in place, Nora stopped and checked them against the earliest plan. The doorway tab gave her the first alignment. The passage wall tab gave her the second. She used the guarded dividers to transfer the distance from the doorway to the rain chain corner, lifting the tool between every comparison. The small circle on the film needed to move scarcely at all. Nora erased one edge of it, gathered the crumbs into her palm, and drew the circle again a pencil width nearer the corner. Then she checked the receiving channel. Its position agreed closely enough across all three plans to be shown as one shared feature. She wrote no date beside it. The channel belonged to the frame, not to any single route. The earliest water line came first. Nora studied the long central stones shown on the cream paper. With the bone folder held above the protective sheet, she followed the old drainage mark from the chain corner, along the low joint, and outward toward the quayside boundary. She noted where it crossed an imaginary line drawn from the doorway. Then she looked back to the transparent film. Her pencil moved from the small circle across the open courtyard shape. The line traveled farther outward than tonight's stream. It passed the position of the long slab edge, and then turned gradually toward the grate. Nora kept the graphite pale. The purpose was to preserve a route, not to imitate the darkness of the old ink. When the line reached the receiving wall, she lifted the pencil. One route now crossed the film. It looked solitary there, a shallow diagonal between the two stable points. Nora compared it once more with the earliest plan. The beginning was right. The middle needed to hold its outward course a little longer. She erased only that section. The film released the graphite cleanly. After Nora brushed away the eraser crumbs, no gray shadow remained. She redrew the middle with a quieter bend and checked it again. This time the relation to the Longheim paving stones was clear. On her notes, beside the earliest date, she made a short straight sample of the same graphite line. That would become the key later. For now, it simply ensured that the first route and its date remained paired. The second plan required a different curve. Its smaller reset stones offered the water an earlier turn. Nora located the relevant joint through the magnifier, returned the glass to its sleeve, and transferred two measured positions with the guarded dividers. One marked the place where the root left the first paving edge. The other marked its approach to the wall channel. She placed two tiny graphite dots on the film. They were working points, light enough to disappear beneath the finished line. From the chain circle she drew toward the first, then allowed the pencil to bend inward through the second and continue to the grate. The second route lay near the first at its beginning. Then the two separated. The earliest line traveled outward while the later one turned sooner across the rearranged stones. Nora sat back and looked at them together. They did not suggest that one drawing corrected the other. Their difference was too gentle for that. They showed two surfaces, doing the same work in slightly altered ways. She added a second line sample beside the second date in her notes. To distinguish it from the first, she broke the sample into short, even dashes. On the overlay, she carefully lifted every other small section of the second root with the narrow corner of the eraser. The result was a dashed line, quiet but clearly separate from the continuous root beside it. The action took time. Erase a short space. Brush away the crumbs. Leave an equal length of graphite. Turn the film slightly beneath the lamp and continue. Rain made an easy rhythm for it. Fine drops touched the windows. The roof chain answered at a slower pace. Nora worked between those sounds, shortening one graphite section after another until the dashed root reached the grate. She inspected the film from standing height. The two lines could be followed without strain. Where they crossed, the unbroken root remained visible beneath the open spaces of the dashed one. Neither had been made so dark that it dominated. The latest old plan came next. Its broad central slab was close to the present arrangement, but its narrow neighboring stone lay differently. Nora used the passage threshold and the wall channel as references, then marked the old root's shallow crossing of the central area. For this third line, she chose a pattern of a long stroke followed by a single small gap. She first drew the whole root in a light continuous motion. It left the chain corner, followed a joint briefly, crossed the broad slab, and turned toward the receiving wall. Then, as before, she used the eraser to open the pattern. Long stroke, small gap, long stroke, small gap. The marks were simple enough to copy into the key, and distinct enough to remain legible where the roots drew close. Nora paused at the middle of the courtyard frame. All three old lines now passed through that area. The earliest lay farthest outward. The second turned inward sooner. The latest crossed between them at a mild angle. Because the graphite was pale and the patterns differed, the center did not become tangled. She held the film by two edges and raised it a little from the table. The lamplight passed through it. Without the grain of the tabletop beneath, the roots became clearer. Three fine gray courses floated between the shared chain and the shared channel. Nora lowered the film again, keeping its lower edge aligned with the archival board. The fourth root waited on the clipboard. Her field sketch showed the present stream beginning close to the passage side, leaving the first seam, and curving over the shallow dip of the broad slab. The dotted guide to the third handrail upright fixed its position. She had watched that line repeat enough times to know where the sketch was exact, and where it was approximate. She moved the clipboard beside the film. Unlike the roots copied from old ink, the present one belonged to moving water. Its smallest edges altered from moment to moment, widening along a joint and narrowing as it crossed the stone. Nora did not try to preserve those passing variations. She recorded the steady course underneath them. She measured from the passage wall to the dotted guide on the sketch and transferred that distance to the film. She checked the position of the first seam. Then she added the point at which the water began its curve toward the grate. For the present route, Nora used a fine line made of closely spaced dots. She touched the pencil to the film and lifted it. Moved a little, touched and lifted again. The dots crossed the first section near the passage, followed the seam, and entered the central slab. There they formed the same small curve she had redrawn outside. The line then approached the graded channel nearer the middle of the wall. Dot by dot, the present rain joined the three earlier routes. Nora finished at the grate and rested the pencil beside the eraser. The practical consequence of the evening's discovery was now visible. If she had assumed that one of the old plans was inaccurate, she might have made a single corrected line and left the differences unexplained. Instead, the film held all four arrangements. The changed paving remained legible in the changed courses of water, while the old sheets carried nothing new at all. Nora drew the overlay nearer and began its key. In the open lower corner, she copied the four line styles in a neat vertical row. Beside the unbroken line, she wrote the earliest date. Beside the even dashes, she wrote the second. The long strokes with small gaps received the third date. Beside the dotted line, she wrote present observation. Below the key, she added a short description. Rain route across reset courtyard paving. She considered the words, then left them as they were. They said enough. The overlay did not need a theory of the courtyard or a full account of every stone. It needed to tell another reader why four lines appeared between one chain and one channel. At the lower edge, she added the evening's date in smaller graphite. The writing remained erasable. The whole sheet remained removable. Nothing about the record required the plans to be altered or permanently joined. Nora used the bone folder as a pointer once more. She began at the rain chain circle and followed the continuous line. It took the oldest outward course. She returned to the circle and followed the dashed line through the earlier turn. The long stroke route crossed the broad slab. The dotted present route stayed nearer the passage before curving toward the same grate. Four useful routes across changing paving. The sentence from her notes had become a drawing. She checked the overlay against each source in turn. For the earliest plan, she confirmed the long stones and the outward run. For the second, she checked the smaller paving and earlier bend. For the third, she matched the cross slab angle. Finally, she placed the field sketch beside the transparent frame and followed the dotted route from the third handrail upright to the receiving channel. One of the present dots sat slightly too far toward the wall. Nora removed it with the point of the clean eraser and placed it again. The adjustment was tiny, but afterward the curve felt easier. It followed the stone rather than cutting across it. She made no other changes. The scale references still agreed. The fixed walls held their positions. The differences between the routes could be seen without exaggeration. Nora set the guarded dividers back into the tool tray. She returned the magnifier to its sleeve and folded the archival board away from the working edge. The bone folder stayed beside her hand, its inherited surface pale against the table. The overlay was not yet ready to leave the room. Its graphite needed a little time to rest undisturbed, and Nora still had to remove the temporary tabs from the protective sheets and return the plans to the orderly state in which Jonas had left them. The comparison itself, however, had taken its useful form. The next stage would narrow the work. Check the key once more. Place the transparent sheet safely in a labeled sleeve and carry that sleeve along the familiar way to the reading room. She would carry only the overlay. The three original plans would remain here in the long map room, protected and supported. The walking map already resting in the reading room would remain beneath its own clean cover. Nothing from that earlier task needed reopening. Nora placed two clean weights beyond the drawn frame, where they could hold the film without touching graphite. The transparent sheet lay quietly between them. Through it she could see the tabletop, the faint reflection of the lamp, and 4 gray roots sharing a beginning and an end. Outside, water descended the iron chain. It crossed the present stones by the dotted course, though no eye needed to follow it just then. The plans had supplied their 3 earlier lines. Nora's observation had supplied the 4th. Together they recorded not a correction, but a succession of ordinary, useful surfaces. She turned her notes so the 4 dated entries faced the overlay and left the pencil across the blank space below them. The room had grown softer around the finished drawing. Rain still touched the windows. The covered passage waited beyond the open door. On the table, the removable film held the courtyard's changing rain lines, without asking any old sheet to change with them. Nora let the graphite rest beneath the shaded lamp, ready for its sleeve and the short return path to the reading room. Nora left the transparent overlay beneath the 2 clean weights while she returned the 3 old plans to order. The graphite on the film had already lost the slight shine it held when first laid down. 4 roots crossed the clear courtyard frame, one continuous, one evenly dashed, one broken by smaller gaps, and one made from close, patient dots. Each began at the small circle of the rain chain. Each reached the narrow double line of the graded channel. The differences remained visible without becoming busy. Nora read the key once from top to bottom. The 3 plan dates stood beside their line samples. Present observations stood beside the dotted route. Below them the description remained plain and sufficient. Rain route across reset courtyard paving. She compared that wording with her notes and made no change. The overlay would be useful because it allowed the plans to agree in the right way. They did not agree on the exact position of the shallow run, because the stones beneath the water had not stayed in the same arrangement. They agreed on the purpose of the courtyard surface. Rain descended at the same corner, found the low course available to it, and traveled toward the same receiving channel. The comparison had answered its question. Nora did not need to choose a correct line from among the 4. The useful record was their succession. She moved first to the latest plan. 2 pale removable tabs marked the common doorway and the beginning of the passage wall on its protective sheet. Nora lifted the corner of the first tab with a fingernail and peeled it back slowly, keeping her other hand away from the old paper beneath. The tab released without resistance. She placed it on the scrap reserved for used temporary materials, then removed the second in the same way. The clear protective sheet showed no trace of adhesive. Beneath it, the pale plan remained exactly as it had been, its broad central slab and shallow drainage mark unchanged. On the second plan, Nora removed the matching pair of tabs. The smaller reset paving became an uninterrupted drawing again. She lifted 1 clear weight, checked that the protective layer still lay evenly, and lowered the weight nearer the sound outer margin. The earliest plan came last. Its cream paper rested quietly beneath the film, the long central stones extending across the courtyard as they had throughout the evening. Nora removed the doorway tab and then the passage wall tab. The old drainage line, slightly darker than the paving joints around it, returned to being one modest feature among walls, measurements, and stone edges. She set the used tabs together. Nothing remained attached to the coverings. No graphite had crossed the clear layers. No weight pressed a softened edge. The folded support beneath the third plan was still where Jonas had placed it, and the slight natural waves in the sheets had not been forced flat. Nora gathered the guarded dividers and returned them to the shallow tool tray. The magnifier, already inside its cloth sleeve, went beside them. She folded the clean archival board and placed it in the drawer with the rule. Her field sketch remained on the clipboard. The light graphite line crossed its simple rectangle from the roof chain circle to the grate. A dotted guide still connected the paving joint to the third handrail upright. Nora looked at it once more, then wrote overlay prepared beneath the sketch, followed by the evening's date. The field sheet was not part of the reading room material. It was a working observation, useful for showing how the present dotted route had been placed. She unclipped it, laid it beside her comparison notes, and placed both in the temporary work folder Jonas had left at the end of the table. The folders stayed in the long map room with the plans. Only the overlay would travel. Nora turned toward the transparent film. Before lifting the weights, she angled the shaded lamp slightly, so the light fell across rather than directly onto its surface. The graphite lines became clearer. She followed each route without touching it. The earliest continuous line held its outward course beside the long paving stones. The dashed route turned sooner through the smaller reset pattern. The third route crossed the broad slab in longer broken strokes. The dotted present route began nearer the passage, followed the first seam, and made its shallow curve toward the grate. At the center, the four courses approached and separated without losing their identities. At the wall, they settled into the same narrow channel. Nora checked the labels against the three plans one final time. Earliest date, second date, latest date, present observation. The order was right. The shared frame was correctly oriented. The passage wall, chain corner, and receiving channel held the comparison steady. She drew an empty archival sleeve from the supply drawer. It was slightly larger than the tracing film and open along one short edge. Its surface was clear, though less perfectly transparent than the overlay itself. A narrow paper strip ran along one side for a label. Nora placed the sleeve on the table beside the film. With her graphite pencil, she wrote on the paper strip before inserting anything. Courtyard rain routes, 3 plans and present observation. Beneath that, she added the 3 plan dates in order, followed by the evening's date. The writing was compact but unhurried. She left a small space at the end of the strip where Jonas could add a catalog reference in blue pencil, if he wished. The sleeve did not claim to contain the plans. Its label made clear that it held a comparison drawn from them. Nora let the pencil rest. Then she removed the lower clean weight from the overlay and set it aside. The film lifted slightly at the released corner, retaining a soft curve from its former roll. She moved the empty sleeve closer before removing the second weight. With both hands, she raised the overlay by its blank outer margins. The graphite frame remained untouched. The clear sheet bowed gently between her hands, and the 4 lines seemed for a moment to float against the darkened windows beyond the table. She lowered one short edge into the sleeve. The film entered without catching. Nora guided it forward a little at a time, supporting the free portion with one hand, while the other kept the sleeve open. When only a narrow margin remained outside, she used the broad, smooth side of the bone folder against the sleeve's exterior to guide the last corner inward. The inherited tool never touched the graphite. The overlay settled fully inside. Nora withdrew the bone folder and looked through the sleeve. Its surface softened the pencil mark slightly, but every pattern remained legible. The label strip sat beyond the drawn courtyard frame and covered none of the key. She closed the sleeve's plain protective flap. It did not fasten with adhesive. The fold alone held it in place and could be opened whenever the overlay needed to be examined. The loose, transparent film had become a contained reading copy. Nora placed the sleeved overlay on the clear end of the table and laid one clean weight outside the drawn area while she finished putting away her tools. The graphite pencil returned to her work bag. The clean eraser went into its small paper wrapper so that no remaining crumb could scatter. Last of all, she picked up the bone folder. Its pale surface was warm from her hand. She wiped it once with a dry cotton cloth and slipped it into the narrow compartment of her bag. The evening had required no pressure from it, only pointing, guiding, and one light pass across the curled film. Those were familiar uses, quiet extensions of the work she had learned in her former workshop. Nora closed the tool tray. The 3 plans remained beneath their protective sheets, aligned no longer by temporary tabs but still arranged in their dated order. The work folder held her field sketch and notes. The empty portion of the table had widened again. She turned off the farther shaded lamp. The reflected table disappeared from one of the dark windows. Rain remained there instead, drawing fine paths down the glass. The sleeve was the only thing still waiting to move. Nora lifted the clean weight and returned it to the table edge. She picked up the sleeve with both hands, holding it level. It was light enough that the motion required almost no adjustment in her shoulders. Inside, the transparent film remained flat, the graphite roots visible through the cover. She left her work bag beneath the table. The reading room was only a short carrying distance away, and she would return once to collect the bag before settling the map room for the night. At the passage door, she paused. The rain had continued without changing its character. Water gathered along the handrail and passed through the shallow dips in joined drops. Beyond it, the roof chain shone beneath the courtyard lamp. The thin stream on the paving appeared and disappeared as it crossed areas of stronger and weaker light. Nora carried the sleeve along the covered passage. She did not step into the courtyard again. There was nothing there that needed confirming. From the sheltered path, she could see the beginning of the present route near the chain, and the final turn toward the grated channel. The central curve lay partly beyond the best of the light, but she knew its relation to the broad slab now. The dotted line inside the sleeve recorded it without pretending to capture every moving edge. At the midpoint of the passage, Nora slowed beside the third handrail upright. Below it, the paving joint used in her field sketch met the threshold. Rain had darkened the stones beyond the dry margin, making the seam clear for a few feet before the surface reflection softened it. She did not stop to measure. The reference had done its work. It could return to being part of the ordinary passage, one upright among the others, one joint among many, useful to anyone walking there, whether or not they noticed it. A bead of water traveled along the rail beside Nora's left hand. It reached the upright and divided, one part descending the metal, the other remaining round on its upper edge. Nora continued toward the reading room. The route narrowed away from the open courtyard. The close sound of rain on stone gave way to its softer sound against the windows. Lamplight from the reading room lay across the floor ahead, warm and still. She entered without switching on anything new. The repaired walking map from her previous shift rested beneath its clean protective cover on the broad reading table. Its earlier bench correction remained safely closed within that finished piece of work. Nora did not lift the cover or draw it aside. At the opposite end of the table, the reading room atlas waited in its usual place. It was still empty. Nothing had been placed into its binding or fixed among its leaves. The evening's overlay had been prepared and approved as a useful reading room record, but binding belonged to later work. For now, the labeled sleeve was the right resting state, protected, separate, and available without changing either the original plans or the atlas. Nora lowered the sleeve onto a clean sheet of archival board beside the atlas. She aligned its label toward the reader's side of the table. The paper strip could be read without turning the sleeve, and the 4 roots showed faintly through the clear cover behind it. The walking map remained under its own protection. The new overlay rested beside the empty atlas. The 2 pieces did not need to be joined or compared. One carried a familiar route on foot. The other carried the changing route of rain across the courtyard stones. Each had come from a different evening and answered a different ordinary question. Nora placed a light cover sheet over the sleeve, leaving the label strip visible. The cover kept dust from its surface without concealing what it was. She added no note beyond the label already there. There was no need to leave a question for Jonas. If he opened the sleeve, he would find the 4-line key. If he looked at the working folder in the long map room, he would find the plan references and the present field sketch. The relation between them was direct and complete enough for another person to follow. Visitors might later use the overlay to understand why old plans showed the courtyard's drainage line in slightly different places. They would not need to imagine damage, error, or hidden construction. They could see that the stones had been reset through ordinary maintenance, and that the water had adjusted its course each time. The courtyard had been cared for by keeping it useful. That was why these modest plans deserved to remain together in the catalog. They preserved not only the official edges of walls and passages, but the small practical arrangements by which people continued to use the harbor buildings in rain. Nora rested one hand on the table's edge. The conclusion did not make the room feel larger. It made the evening smaller in a pleasant way. 3 old sheets had supplied 3 rain lines. The courtyard had supplied a 4th. The overlay held them together, and the originals remained untouched. She turned back toward the covered passage. Only her workbag remained to be collected from the long map room. The sleeve needed no further movement tonight. It lay level on the archival board beside the empty atlas, its label visible beneath the edge of the cover sheet. Nora walked the familiar passage without looking for anything new. Rain descended the chain beyond the handrail. Water crossed the paving toward the grate. The long map room waited, with one shaded lamp still burning above the protected plans. She would put away the last weight, take up her bag, and leave the table quiet for the night. Behind her in the reading room, the transparent overlay rested safely in its labeled sleeve, ready for the next careful stage of the atlas, and requiring nothing more from the rain. Nora returned along the covered passage at an easy pace. She carried nothing now. The labeled sleeve remained in the reading room, level on its archival board beside the empty atlas. The repaired walking map rested under its own clean cover. Both pieces were safe, and neither needed another touch tonight. Rain continued beyond the handrail. The drops along its upper edge had grown close together. Some stayed round and still. Others joined and moved through the shallow dips in the painted metal, leaving narrow, bright tracks behind them. Beneath the eave, the passage stones remained mostly dry. Only the outer margin held the darker color of rain. Nora passed the 3rd handrail upright without stopping. The joint below it was only a joint again. It met the threshold and continued across the paving until reflections softened its edge. She had used it to place the present route on the field sketch. The dotted route now rested inside the transparent overlay. Nothing more needed to be measured. At the open door of the long map room, the remaining shaded lamp cast a quiet rectangle across the passage floor. Nora stepped inside. The room had changed very little since she had carried the sleeve away. The 3 Old Quay plans still lay in dated order beneath their clear protective sheets. Clean weights held the sound margins. The folded support remained beneath the softened corner of the 3rd sheet. Her field sketch and comparison notes rested together in the temporary work folder at the end of the table. The transparent film was no longer there. Its absence left a clear space in the lamplight. Earlier, that space had held a curling blank sheet, then 4 graphite roots, then the labeled sleeve. Now the grain of the tabletop showed through without interruption. Nora stood beside the empty place for a moment. Her body had settled further since the beginning of the shift. The careful attention in her shoulders had eased. Her hands no longer held the slight readiness of measuring. The evening's useful choice had already been made, checked, and carried to its resting place. Only established actions remained. She moved the clean weight that had held the sleeve back to the table edge, where the other unused weights stood. She placed it beside them rather than stacking it. Each clear block caught a softened part of the lamp and held it without sparkle. The used removable tabs rested together on their scrap. Nora folded the scrap once around them. She did not sort them or try to use them again. Their small work of alignment was over. The 3 plans needed no further arrangement. She looked across them from earliest to latest. The cream sheet showed its long central stones. The second plan held the smaller paving pattern. The third showed the broad central slab. Their drainage marks remained separate, each belonging to the courtyard surface recorded on its own date. No added line crossed the old paper. No note rested on a protective sheet. Nora did not trace the roots again with the bone folder. The tool was already clean and returned to her work bag. Its familiar shape waited in the narrow compartment where she kept it, ready for another evening, without requiring one more gesture from this one. She closed the temporary work folder over the field sketch and notes. The cover came down lightly. Inside it, the present route remained a pale graphite curve between the circle for the rain chain and the paired lines for the grate. The dated comparisons lay beneath it. Jonas would be able to read them in the map room if he wished. But there was no instruction waiting for him, and no uncertainty asking to be resolved. Nora slid the closed folder a little farther from the protected plans. It remained on the same table, within easy reach, its edge square with the wood. That small movement was enough. The working papers had become quiet beside the source sheets. Rain touched the windows. With the farther lamp already off, the glass no longer held a complete reflection of the long table. It showed only the remaining shaded light near Nora, a dim shape of her sleeve, and fine drops traveling downward through the darkness outside. She watched one drop meet another. The joined water widened, paused, and continued toward the lower frame. A second line followed nearby, taking a different course over the glass. Both slipped out of sight without sound enough to separate from the rain around them. Nora lowered the remaining lamp a little by turning its shade toward the table. The light narrowed across the plans. Their edges stayed visible, but the room beyond them softened. The protective sheets reflected only a low band now, and the clear weights became almost colorless. She checked the folded support beneath the third plan once more from where she stood. It had not shifted. The paper above it held the same gentle wave it had held when she arrived. There was no reason to flatten it, no reason to lift the sheet, and no reason to improve an arrangement already doing its work. Nora bent and took her bag from beneath the table. The flask inside gave a muted weight against the wrapped bread and cheese. She had not needed to widen the evening's route for a pause in the kitchen. The small meal could go home with her. Nothing about the shift required another room. She set the bag on the stool while she drew down her sleeves. The fabric passed over her wrists with a soft brushing sound. She smoothed one cuff and then the other. Her graphite pencil, eraser, magnifier, and bone folder were already put away. The guarded dividers rested in their tray. The folding rule and archival board had returned to the drawer. The table held only what belonged there for the night. 3 protected plans, the closed work folder, the clear weights, the shaded lamp. Nora stood at the end of the table and let her gaze travel once along its length. This was not another inspection of the comparison. She did not count dates or check scales. She simply allowed the ordered surface to become familiar before the light went out. The earliest plan lay nearest. The second followed. The latest rested beyond it with its folded support. Their different paving lines were quiet under the clear sheets. Rain was no longer something to interpret from them. It had become sound at the windows and water in the courtyard, repeating without asking to be recorded again. Nora lifted her bag from the stool. Then she turned off the shaded lamp. The long map room did not become wholly dark. Warm light from the covered passage entered through the open door, enough to show the near edge of the table and the pale rectangles beneath their covers. The windows changed at once. Their faint interior reflections disappeared, leaving only rain-dark glass. Nora waited until her eyes settled. The plans remained where they had been. She did not walk the room from end to end. There was no need for a last circuit. The work had occupied one table, and the table was already in order. She stepped into the passage and left the map room behind her. The courtyard lamp gave the handrail a narrow amber edge. Water beads caught that edge one by one. Farther out, the rain chain hung in broken brightness, each iron link appearing when water passed over it and fading when the flow thinned. Nora put on her coat beneath the covered roof. The shoulder she had brushed dry on arrival was dry now. She settled the coat around herself and lifted the strap of the bag into a comfortable place. The passage air was cool enough to feel clear against her face. It carried the smell of wet stone and iron. The faint, dry scent of the map room remained behind her, mixed for a moment with the rain before the open courtyard air took its place. She did not enter the courtyard. From the sheltered side, she watched the water leave the bottom of the chain. It touched the first stone and spread into a small, dark shape. A narrow part of that shape found the seam. The stream followed it briefly, then left the joint and moved across the broad slab. The courtyard lamp did not illuminate the whole route at once. Near the chain, the water shone. Across the middle, it became a darker line within dark stone. Near the graded channel, it caught the light again. Nora knew the curve between those brighter sections. She had watched it, sketched it, corrected it, and placed it on the overlay as a line of close graphite dots. Now she allowed the paper version to remain in the reading room and the water version to remain outside. Neither needed the other in order to continue. A fuller run descended the roof chain. The links gave a mild, uneven rhythm as the water passed from one to the next. At the bottom, the stream widened for a breath, then returned to its usual narrow course. It curved over the same slight dip in the stone and reached the grate without gathering. The sound at the channel was low and steady. Nora rested one hand lightly on the passage rail, choosing a dry place beneath the eave. The painted metal felt cool through her palm. A line of beads lay farther along, beyond her hand. She remained still while one bead joined another. Their combined weight drew them through the nearest dip. They moved a short distance, slowed beside an upright, and divided. One part traveled down the side of the rail. The other stayed above, round again beneath the lamp. The evening had begun with the same small motion. Then it had been an opening, water making the passage and courtyard ready to observe. Now it asked for no attention beyond the comfort of seeing it repeat. Nora lifted her hand. A faint, dry warmth remained in her palm for a moment where the rail had been sheltered. She tucked that hand into her coat pocket and continued a few steps along the passage. She did not return to the reading room. The labeled sleeve was already resting there, with its strip turned toward the reader's side of the table. The light cover sheet protected it while leaving the label visible. The empty atlas beside it remained empty, as it should. The overlay had been approved as a useful reading room record, but it had not been bound or fixed into anything. That later work was not part of this night. The repaired walking map also remained under its cover. Its completed bench correction belonged to the previous shift and had not been reopened. The reading room held both safe pieces without asking Nora to compare them. Her path stayed in the passage. Behind her, the long map room had gone quiet around the three original plans. Ahead of her, the covered way continued beside the rain. The courtyard occupied the open side, contained by its familiar stone walls. Harbor sounds arrived only in softened fragments. Water beyond the chart house made a low, even presence. Once, a line outside the courtyard tapped gently against a mast. The sound did not repeat. Rain filled the space afterward, close on stone and finer on the hidden panes. Nora slowed near the courtyard threshold. She had stood there on arrival without crossing. Later, she had gone as far as the dry margin to draw the present route. Now she stayed beneath the roof again. The paving stones were darkest near the rain chain. Their edges grew clearer where the lamp skimmed them. The broad central slab showed no sharp boundary of wetness because the rain had settled evenly across its surface. Only moving water separated itself. A thin thread came from the chain. It followed the first edge. It bent across the stone. It passed toward the graded channel. The course was never held in perfect stillness. A little more water broadened it. A little less narrowed it. One edge wandered by the width of a bright reflection and returned. The overall curve remained. Nora breathed in slowly. The wet mineral scent of the courtyard had deepened as the stone cooled. Iron from the chain added a faint, clean sharpness. No paper smell reached this far now. The workroom and its protected plans seemed settled within the building, close but no longer active. She breathed out. Her shoulders lowered with the breath. Nothing had been lost by putting the comparison away. The 4 roots were contained in the sleeve. The 3 old ones remained visible through their different graphite patterns. The present one remained dotted and plain. Their common beginning and common receiving channel held the overlay together. Outside the sleeve, rain continued to choose only the surface before it. Nora took another slow step. The lamp's light fell across the passage floor in a softened band. Her shoes made almost no sound on the dry stones. She could hear the quiet shift of her bag at her side. Then even that became still when she stopped again near the handrail. A row of new beads had gathered there. They reflected the lamp as small amber points. Some were clear at their edges. Others held a dark image of the courtyard wall. Each changed slowly as more rain touched the rail. Nora did not follow any one drop for long. Her attention had widened from the exact work of the table. The rail, the chain, the stones, and the low channel could remain separate things again. She no longer needed to bring them into alignment. The building held the evening in simple layers. Protected paper rested in the long map room. The transparent overlay rested in the reading room. Rain rested briefly on the rail before moving on. Water crossed the courtyard. Nora stood beneath the passage roof, warm in her coat, with her bag already packed. There was no more dialogue in the rooms. Jonas's blue pencil note had done its work at the beginning of the shift and remained with the practical materials of the table. Nora had answered it through the overlay rather than with another message. 3 courtyard plans had been compared. The present route had been observed once. All 4 courses had been recorded without altering the originals. The sleeve had been labeled and carried to its proper resting place. The evening's task was complete. Nora let that completion remain small. It did not change the courtyard. It did not make the rain more orderly than it had been. It simply preserved the ordinary reason that 4 drawings could differ. Stones had been reset through years of care, and water had taken the useful line each surface offered. The rain chain gave another soft sequence of touches. Iron link, stone. The stream below brightened, narrowed, and curved away. Nora began to move toward the sheltered end of the passage, keeping the same unhurried pace. She did not look back into the map room. She did not step toward the reading room table. Both places were stable behind their walls and doors, ready for morning without another adjustment. At the end of the passage, she paused and turned only toward the courtyard. The lamp remained warm beneath its hood. Below it, the paving held a quiet shine. The graded channel received the water with no more sound than before. Along the handrail, another pair of beads joined and slipped through a shallow dip. Nora watched the courtyard stream repeat once more. From the foot of the roof chain, it crossed the first stone, found the seam, and entered the broad slab. There it made the same small curve she had seen throughout the evening. It faded briefly in the weaker light, returned as a thin silver line, and reached the grate. Then another thread followed. The chart house rested around that gentle movement. The plans lay protected. The graphite lay covered. The passage remained dry beneath its roof. And under the courtyard lamp, water repeated the same small curve across the stones.